Sometimes your life begins to change before there is anything visible to prove it. The same room, the same routine, the same people, the same schedule you have followed for months, maybe years, and yet somewhere underneath all of it, something no longer feels the same. You cannot point to a single event. Nothing has technically gone wrong, but conversations that used to feel effortless now feel like work. Places that used to feel like home now feel slightly foreign, as if you are visiting a version of your life rather than living inside it. Roles you have played for years, the reliable one, the strong one, the easy one to be around, suddenly feel like a costume that no longer fits. Solitude feels different too. Not lonelier necessarily, just heavier with meaning, as if something inside you is waiting to be heard in the quiet. And beneath all of it, there is a strange, wordless grief. Grief without an obvious loss. Grief for something you cannot name, because it has not technically ended yet. What if this discomfort is not evidence that your life is falling apart, but evidence that an old identity is losing its hold? By the end of this video, you will understand why change often begins quietly, why the old life starts feeling wrong before the new one appears, and how Jungian psychology explains this difficult, disorienting in-between stage. Let's start with the feeling itself, because it is more precise than most people realize. It usually shows up as impatience. A conversation that once felt nourishing now feels like a rehearsal of things already said. A friend tells a story you've heard before, and instead of warmth, you feel a strange fatigue, as if part of you has already left the room. It shows up as emotional distance from familiar places. You sit in your usual chair, in your usual kitchen, and something about the scene feels slightly displaced, like a photograph of your life, rather than your life itself. It shows up as exhaustion from pretending, not lying exactly, just performing a version of yourself that used to come naturally and now requires effort. Effort to smile at the right moment, effort to sound enthusiastic about things that no longer interest you, effort to keep playing a character whose lines you no longer believe. And it shows up as an increased need for solitude, not because you have stopped loving the people around you, but because something in you is asking for space to hear itself think. You are not tired of your life. You may be tired of the person you have to become to keep living it. This is the part most people misread. They assume that if nothing dramatic has happened, then nothing real is happening. But in Jungian psychology, the most significant movements of the psyche often begin far below the surface of ordinary awareness, in a layer of the mind Jung called the unconscious, the part of us that holds memory, emotion, instinct, and potential that consciousness has not yet caught up with. The conscious mind, the part of you that plans your day and manages your responsibilities, is often the last to know what is happening. It is not slow because it is weak. It is slow because it was built to maintain continuity, to keep the story of who you are stable, even when the deeper structure beneath that story has already begun to move. This is why a person can be changing internally for months, sometimes years, while still living an almost identical external life. The job stays the same, the relationships stay the same, the daily rituals stay the same, but something underneath has already begun to shift its weight. The visible life is often the last part of you to change. This single idea explains so much of the confusion people feel during a quiet transition. They look at their life and see no proof of change, so they assume they are imagining things, or being ungrateful, or simply going through a phase. But Jung's work suggests that psychological transformation is rarely instant. It moves the way weather systems move, invisibly at first, gathering pressure long before the sky visibly changes. One of the first places this pressure becomes noticeable is in what Jung called the persona. The persona is not a mask in the dishonest sense. It is the identity you built, often unconsciously, to survive and belong. The version of you shaped by family expectations, cultural approval, professional image, and the subtle demands of the people around you. It is how you learn to be accepted. For years, the persona can feel like simply who you are. It becomes uncomfortable only when the living self underneath it has quietly outgrown the role. Think of the person who has always been the strong one, the one others lean on, the one who is never allowed to fall apart, because the family or the friend group has organized itself around that reliability. For years, this role may have felt like identity, but at some point, being strong all the time stops feeling like strength. It starts feeling like erasure. Or think of the person who has always been agreeable, the one who smooths conflict, absorbs tension, keeps the peace, even at their own expense. Agreeableness may have once felt like kindness. Eventually, it can start to feel like disappearance. The caretaker who has never been allowed to need anything. The person who learned to suppress anger because anger once felt dangerous. The one who performed success because vulnerability was never safe in their family. These are not flaws, they are adaptations, intelligent responses to an earlier environment. But adaptations that once protected you can, later in life, begin to confine you. When the persona starts to crack, it rarely announces itself with drama. It shows up as fatigue, as irritability in moments that never used to bother you, as a small, persistent question late at night. Is this actually me, or is this simply what I learned to become? And this is usually when the next stage begins, the return of the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow refers to the parts of the personality that were split off, suppressed, or never permitted expression, not because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient, unsafe, or unwelcome in the environment where you grew up. Anger that had nowhere to go. Ambition that seemed selfish. Need that seemed weak. Sadness that made others uncomfortable. The shadow is not your enemy. It is neglected material, waiting for acknowledgement. When an old identity begins to loosen, shadow material often resurfaces, not as pathology, but as pressure seeking release. This can look like unexpected anger toward people who have done nothing new, simply because you can no longer suppress what you have been swallowing for years. It can look like restlessness that has no clear cause. Envy that surprises you, pointing toward desires you had buried. Dreams that suddenly feel more vivid, more symbolic, more insistent. A new, almost intolerant sensitivity to dishonesty, in others and in yourself. None of this means something is wrong with you. From a depth psychology perspective, it often means the opposite. Parts of you that were exiled for the sake of belonging are finally being invited back into the room. This is also why relationships and routines can begin to feel subtly wrong, even when nothing about them has objectively changed. Most relationships, families, and friendships are organized around a kind of unspoken choreography. Each person occupying a familiar role, each interaction following a predictable rhythm. This choreography works as long as everyone stays roughly the same. But when one person begins changing internally, even quietly, the entire structure can start to feel unstable. because the role that person used to play is no longer being performed the same way. This is important to understand clearly, because it is easy to misinterpret. The relationship is not necessarily broken, and neither is the other person. Sometimes nothing is wrong with the relationship. The version of you that belonged inside it is simply disappearing. This does not mean every relationship affected by inner change should end. Some relationships can adapt and deepen once both people understand what is happening, but some cannot. And that painful possibility is part of what makes this stage of life so disorienting. Which brings us to the hardest part, the in-between. This is the stage where the old identity has stopped feeling true, but a new one has not yet solidified. You are no longer fully the person you used to be, but you cannot yet describe who you are becoming. You may feel isolated, even around people who love you, because you do not yet have language for what is shifting. You may find yourself questioning decisions you made with total confidence only a year or two earlier. Not because those decisions were wrong, but because they were made by a version of you that is quietly retiring. This liminal stage often feels like failure. It is not. In Jungian terms, it closely resembles the difficult middle phase of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a more complete, more integrated self, rather than remaining a collection of inherited roles and unconscious defenses. The old identity has stopped feeling true, but the new identity has not yet learned how to speak. This is the part of the process people find hardest to accept. The wrongness arrives first. You feel that something no longer fits long before you have any picture of what will replace it. There's no map handed to you at the moment the old one stops working. Just the discomfort, unexplained, arriving early, as if to warn you before it can tell you why. This is often where people panic and try to force resolution, rushing into a new job, a new relationship, a new persona, simply to escape the discomfort of not knowing who they are for a while. But clarity forced too early is rarely real clarity. It is usually the old identity in disguise trying to reassert control. Confusion is sometimes what truth feels like before it has language. Jung described psychological transformation using the symbolic language of death and rebirth, not literal death. And this is important to say plainly. This video is not describing anything related to physical harm or hopelessness. It is describing something structural inside the psyche. Symbolic death refers to the dissolution of old beliefs that no longer hold, old attachments that have quietly expired, old defenses that once protected a younger version of you, old ambitions inherited rather than chosen, and expectations absorbed from family or culture long before you had the ability to question them. This dissolving can feel like loss because psychologically it is a kind of loss. But in Jung's framework, this dissolution is often the necessary precondition for something more integrated to emerge. Not a completely different person, but a more honest one. A self less shaped by performance and more shaped by truth. There are signs that this rebirth has already quietly begun, even before the outer life shows any evidence of it. You recover more quickly from emotional triggers that once destabilized you for days. You become less willing to betray your own instincts just to keep others comfortable. Solitude starts to feel more honest than performing connection you do not actually feel. Old goals, the ones that once defined your sense of success, stop impressing you the way they used to. You start noticing your own projections, catching yourself in the moment you assign your unresolved feelings to someone else. You can tolerate uncertainty a little longer than you used to. without needing to resolve it immediately. You feel grief for a life you are still technically living, because part of you already knows it is ending. And quietly, you sense that certain decisions have already been made somewhere inside you, long before you consciously admit them. Some endings happen psychologically, long before they happen in reality. Notice what all of these signs have in common. None of them tell you what your new life will look like. They only tell you that the old one has stopped fitting. This is the part almost no one prepares you for. Your old life will start to feel wrong long before you have any idea what the new one is. There is no preview, no rough draft waiting to be revealed, only the growing, unmistakable sense that the way things have been can no longer continue. Arriving well before you have a single answer about what comes next. Now, one important warning. Trying to force this process rarely helps. When people sense that something is changing, they often panic and try to accelerate it. Quitting everything at once, cutting people off abruptly, chasing a new identity like a costume that will finally fit. But transformation forced, ahead of its own timing, tends to create more confusion, not less, because the psyche cannot integrate what it has not yet fully processed. Trusting the process does not mean becoming passive. You still need honesty, with yourself especially. You still need reflection, real boundaries, and the willingness to sit with discomfort instead of immediately escaping it through a new distraction. You still need responsible action in the parts of life that require it. What changes is not your responsibility, but your relationship to control. Your task is not to invent a new self. It is to stop interrupting the one that is trying to emerge. So if you are in this stage right now, if the old excitement has quietly drained out of things that once meant something, if conversations feel heavier, if solitude feels different, if you sense an ending you cannot quite explain, this may not be a sign that something is wrong with you. Perhaps nothing dramatic has happened yet. Perhaps the door has not opened. Perhaps the new life has not introduced itself yet. But somewhere beneath the routines, the explanations and the roles you have quietly outgrown, something has already moved. And once the psyche has begun to change, the outer life, in its own time, eventually has to follow. If this helped you understand something you have been feeling but could not explain, subscribe for more explorations into Carl Jung and depth psychology.